All right, everyone. It is 1 o'clock, so we will get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the APIC Great Lakes 2024 Educational Webinar Series. Denise, Kelsey, and I are excited to introduce this month's topic, what an IP in sterile processing wants IPs to know about sterile processing. So to ensure we can all benefit from this webinar today, please keep your line on mute and not hold. If you put it on hold, it may play a sound on music disrupting the webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, please drop it in the chat so that we may ensure your question is brought forward during our Q&A portion of the webinar. And there are no CEUs available for today's webinar. And please stay tuned after our presentation today for our peer-to-peer mentorship roundtable discussion led by our chapter president-elect Doreen Barrelcast. And with that, I am honored to introduce our speaker today. Rebecca Taylor Alvino is the System Director for Sterile Processing at UCSF Health in San Francisco. She is an experienced and certified perioperative nurse, infection preventionist, certified as a sterile processing technician by HSPA, a licensed clinical nurse specialist in California, recognized as a fellow of APIC, and with the APIC COVID-19 Task Force, recognized as a 2023 APIC Hero of Infection Prevention. Rebecca is the president-elect of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of APIC, the Infection Prevention Advisor for the Pacific West Sterile Processing Association, an active work group participant and voting member of AMI, a peer reviewer for the AORN Journal, and an active member of APIC, including serving as an associate section editor for the APIC Text Online and previous service on the annual conference committee. Welcome, Rebecca, and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Chow, do you want me to share? Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's still morning in California, so bear with me. My name is Rebecca Alvino. I am currently the System Director for Sterile Processing at UCSF Health here in San Francisco. I'm really excited. I love presenting on this topic. There's a lot of information. Kelsey, Chow, can I just confirm that everyone will have access to the slides after this as well? So you're going to hear me sort of blow through some of these slides, but a lot of the information on there will be pertinent as you approach your sterile processing areas or your reprocessing areas. I don't mean to glaze over. There's just a lot of content here, and I want to make sure that I respect your time today. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. I have no problems answering email. Things come up. I genuinely love to help, and I love to try to demystify this area for fellow IPs. So our learning objectives today, first things first, I'm going to discuss some key AMI updates that are pertinent to reprocessing and relevant to infection preventionists. We'll talk about some key rounding elements for the IP and sterile processing departments. And then I'll talk about some key performance indicators in sterile processing that can guide IP assessment in partnership with sterile processing. Chances are you already know one. It's one that we're required to follow for accreditation and regulatory purposes, and that's intermediate use steam sterilization, or IUSS, but there's plenty more out there, and I'll get into those today. I am a paid consultant for Intelligo Technologies, but I am not discussing UVC disinfection nor its validation today. So let me talk to you about why this is important, sterile processing to infection prevention, and I'll do it by bringing up a few recent headlines from the news about dirty instruments, contaminated tools that have been identified at a number of different healthcare facilities across the country. Well, let me tell you a little bit about my why and how I really became interested in disinfection sterilization. I'm an OR nurse by background. I'm a surgical IP, but it was sort of because of an event that happened here, to air my dirty laundry a little bit, that happened in 2016 that really got me invested in sterile processing. And that was, of course, not a Friday afternoon, but a Thursday afternoon when nearly my entire cohort was at APIC National Conference. I received the call from the interim SPD manager at the time who's been in sterile processing longer than I've been alive. I'm going to lose him at the end of the year, and it's a big loss for me. But he called me and he said, Rebecca, I think we have a problem. And so what he had realized was we were going through a lot of transition at that time, where we had just opened a new hospital. A lot of staff from a number of clinics and the existing hospital had moved to that new facility. Well, we had a circumstance where the cleaning of cystoscopes was happening in the clinic before they were being sent to the ambulatory surgery center to be sterilized. Well, when the staff moved to that new hospital and that new clinic building, the person who had all of that information in their head took it all with them. Nothing was written down. IFUs weren't a thing. There weren't any competencies. So for about 6 months, until the time that ambulatory surgery center closed, we had come to realize that the cystoscopes were not being properly cleaned by the clinic because nobody had actually trained the person who was now responsible for doing it to do it properly. So 471 patients had to be notified for potential bloodborne pathogen exposure. And we had to follow them then for 6 months. It was really intense for that period of time because not only was there the patient safety aspect, we knew there was going to be a complaint survey with CMS. We knew that we were going to have the Joint Commission visiting us, and we knew that we had to really rapidly assess our entire system, which as an academic health system was growing seemingly exponentially at the time, to see how are we handling reprocessing. And some of the things that we found in that comprehensive assessment were eye-raising, right? And it was one of those things where I had said, if I think we were maybe like the number 4 hospital in the country at that point. And it was one of those things where I said, if this is what's happening at the number 4 hospital, what's happening at the number 104 hospital? What's happening at the 1004 hospital? Because we had a lot of things that we needed to change, and we needed to change quickly. So that's really how I became very invested in the mission of sterile processing and its importance to infection prevention. I just will go over the very basic steps of reprocessing for high-level disinfection sterilization. Of course, there's a use. We often think of the OR, maybe an ambulatory clinic or a dental clinic, maybe a nursing unit or the ED. That's where the instruments get used. And then you've got this point of use processing that there's been such a huge focus on that needs to happen. And then there's that thorough cleaning and return to use, or whatever that terminal process is, using the Spalding classification to help inform what the intended use of that widget is going to be. Does it require low, intermediate, or high-level disinfection, or does it require sterilization? So when you talk about the Joint Commission hospital standard, and before I get into this, I know that there are a lot of facilities like Trinity Health and other facilities that are DNV accredited, and that is a huge gap for me that I need to close. I can't cite the DNV accreditation standards for this, but I can cite Joint Commission like the back of my hand, because this is the one where I swear I know it backwards and forwards, because it's just the one that whenever we got cited, I was the one that had to address it with our surveyors. It used to be ICO 20201 EP2. Now it's ICO 40101 EP4. The hospital's policies and procedures for cleaning, disinfection, sterilization of reusable medical and surgical devices and equipment. There's a whole laundry list of elements within that standard that talks about what the expectations are for the hospital in terms of policy and procedures. And it's crosswalked with the condition of participation through CMS 42.42A2, 42.51B, and it requires documentation to demonstrate compliance. And as I tell my team, those documentation requirements that we have to maintain are not the law of Rebecca, they're the law of the land. So let's talk about some of those key updates. First one, and this is one that is a bit of a hot topic. It's one that did not come with a little bit of controversy because I sat on this work group. This is TIR 99. This is the processing of dilators, transesophageal, and ultrasound probes in healthcare facilities. There's recommendations about what the design of a processing area, the education for personnel, training, and competency should be, as well as considerations for cleaning, leak testing, disinfection, sterilization. And then one of the things to really keep in mind with this is there were a lot of agencies, including APIC, that signed on to a multi-agency document about how ultrasound probes specifically surface transducers, should be treated in percutaneous procedures. I'm not about to open that can of worms on here, but just be aware that you're going to want to take a look at TIR 99 and just make sure that your facility is following the best practices that your facility needs to practice. ST108 used to be known as TIR 34. This one's gotten a lot of buzz recently, and this is about water quality, utility, critical, and steam. And it talks about the considerations you need to take for your water treatment system at installation and operation, how to qualify them, and how to evaluate. Here's the thing that I'm hearing a lot from IPs, and I've talked a lot with water quality consultants about this recently. The Joint Commission expectations, unless you're having issues with your instrumentation quality, where you think it might be related to the water, there is not a hard and fast expectation at this moment to absolutely be rigidly compliant with ST108. We absolutely have to be addressing Legionella mitigation in our water management plans. You have to have a water management plan per Joint Commission. ST108 may be a part of that, but I would say that unless you really have started to take this on holistically as a part of a multidisciplinary team that includes your maintenance or engineering folks, your IPs, your SPD leadership, do not approach this one lightly. Approach this one holistically, approach it in a very metered way unless you're having a real acute issue. Spot checking water quality and not really approaching it with a mindfulness of what you're going to do with that information once you have it may create more headaches than you want to deal with. So approach this one very carefully. Those are my words of wisdom that I have about ST108. ST91, this is the flexible endoscope standard that has been developed by AMI. It was updated in 2021, released in 2022. A lot of this just, again, has to do with how you set up your reprocessing area. There is now a formal recommendation for certification for folks that are reprocessing flexible endoscopes through HSPA, CBSPD, or SGNA. When it can be supported by your facility resources and it's validated, the device, sterilization is recommended as a terminal process. And this is something I have worked to move forward here at UCSF with small lumen scopes in particular. There are some GI scopes now that are able to be sterilized using low temp gas plasma modalities if your facility has them. Just have to make sure that the devices are validated for it. There is a formal recommendation against manual immersion, high-level disinfection, and liquid chemical sterilization. This is because it's such a process to make sure you don't have air bubbles on the surfaces. You can't see inside the lumens. If you're trying to perfuse the lumens with a high-level disinfectant, how do you know that there isn't an air bubble there? And then, again, there's a formal recommendation for at least 10 minutes of instrument air or minimum HEPA-filtered air for channel drying, and it has to be longer if you still observe moisture. And that's also coming into a lot of IFUs for your endoscopes. This is one a lot of IPs don't know about, and this is PB70, Protective Barrier 70. And the way that I'll frame this is, if you aren't aware of Corey Ofsted's study that she published, I think around the end of 2022, 2023, about droplet dispersal in a decontamination area, this is the research that really dovetails into the why of PB70, which establishes minimum barrier performance requirements for even things like decontamination gowns. It talks about surgical drapes and things like that. But in the SPD world, decontamination gowns really need to have a minimum standard in order to protect your workforce in that decontamination area. So I've hit some of those AMI standard updates. Are you ready to round? This is what I say to IPs. And I know that for a number of IPs that I've given this presentation to, that I've talked to ad hoc, can be some anxiety going into a sterile processing area, especially if you're not used to what type of environment that is. For me, that area would be lab, right? I can go into sterile processing, I can go into the OR and feel very much at ease because I've spent 15 years in surgery. But going into a lab for me is where I get a little bit of agita and a little bit of anxiety about what it is I'm going to see and do I know what I'm going to do when I get there. So when you're an IP going into sterile processing, what do you want to accomplish? If you're there to assess your environment, then I would say the best time to do that is when the work is the lowest in your SPD. That tends to be right after the first cases of the day start. Your decontamination area should be relatively cleared out. Your prep and pack areas may be relatively cleared out. So you can really get a lay of the land and see, where's the damage to the walls? Is there mold or anything like that? You can do that when there's not a lot of work going on. If you're there to look at the way the environment and the people manage themselves at the worst possible time, which is when it's the busiest, ORs tend to break for the day, usually around 3 to 5 p.m. You might have some turnover that's happening in between then, but ORs start to wind down their activity for the day between 3 and 5 p.m. based on how the OR schedules are set up. But that's where you really want to see how the processes and the procedures are tested within the environment and across your personnel. If you're doing an investigation for a potential device-related infection or a cluster, you got to go in there really at any time. So know what your goals are and what it is that you want to accomplish. Bring a vanometer with you so that you can test the pressurizations. Negative for your decontamination areas, positive for your sterile storage and your prep and pack sterilization areas. Are you dressed for the occasion? I will let you know whenever I have to get dressed and I'm not in scrubs like I am today, and I think there might be a chance that I'm going to wear a bunny suit into the department, I'm wearing pants. If you're wearing a skirt, a dress, a kilt, whatever, and it's knee length or even a little bit higher, and you're walking around in a bunny suit, I have a no free show policy, but that's just because I can feel the skirt riding up within the bunny suit. So my suggestion, honestly, is if you can, dress the way you expect to see your SPD personnel dressed when they're inside that department. Be the example you expect to see. So dangly earrings, not the place for that, right? Lots of jewelry, definitely, especially if you're going to be handling instruments for inspection, you definitely want to leave the fancy jewelry in your office or in your locker. If there's any ICRAs to check while you're there, make sure you know what they are, and at least have an idea of what your policies and procedures are for your sterile processing area. You may be getting introduced to this area and you just need to be familiar with them, and you can test knowledge while you're there, but you definitely don't want to go in there with preconceived notions, and just be willing to be a little humble if you need to. If you're not comfortable, be willing to learn from them. And you can check later for to make sure what they're saying actually jives with the policies and procedures that are written and that they align with best practices and regulatory requirements. So I don't know how it is for you guys. When I was an IP, I would go anywhere. And in fact, I'll venture out to the OR, I'll venture to the floors. People don't know I'm the SPD director, even though I've been here for almost 3 years. They still think I'm an IP, and they do this. I'm cleaning my hands, Rebecca. I'm cleaning my hands. And I'm like, cool, I'm an SPD director now. So you still don't know how to clean your hands, though. I think we all have experiences like that. And so it's like, oh my gosh, infection prevention is here. And depending on your relationship with your SPD staff and your leaders, they may be a little bit apprehensive because they're just not used to, or they're a little hesitant when somebody that they perceive as being related to regulatory, related to accreditation, walking in, even though really our intention may just be to be a partner. So when you go in, you start looking at the physical plant. How is everything laid out? Is everything laid out to support a unidirectional path of travel, right? We're going from dirty to clean. We're not going backwards in the process. The space is well constructed. It can withstand the cleaning materials and supplies and disinfectants that we use. There's not a dust and debris accumulation. There's evidence that terminal cleaning is happening every day of operation. Is there condensation on the walls? You get into high humidity areas, there can be evidence of condensation, which can then lead to mold or mildew. Even in your decontamination areas, you don't want to see that. Do you have hand washing facilities and hand cleaning capabilities? Eye washes and eye emergency showers are easily accessible. They're not blocked by case carts. Any pass-through windows you have and doors, they remain closed when they're not in use. If they're open, they're going to alter the pressurizations in your space. And then I don't know that a lot of IPs realize that in ST79 and in ST91, there are actual minimum lighting requirements. You don't want somebody trying to inspect really small instrumentation looking for gross soil or debris in a dark location, right? So if they don't have good overhead lighting, do they have task lighting available at their workstations to help provide that additional lighting needed for adequate inspection? Are your soiled items held inside instrument or decontamination areas? By the way, this is I didn't take this picture at UCSF. I took it somewhere along the way in my career that this was being transported to an SPD. This is not legit. And this is not the law of Rebecca. Again, this is the law of the land. 29 CFR 1910.1030 says you must contain your soiled items. Everything on here is no bueno to go through a hallway on a table cover, on a table. It's just a lot of safety issues there. So your soiled instruments and your soiled items have to be inside your decontamination areas. They can't spill out into the public hallway, and they have to have gotten there compliantly. You've got 3 bay sinks at each decontamination workstation, and there's actually recommendations for the size that they should be. Ideally, they're ergonomic. So when you start thinking about renovations or new construction of SPDs for your SPD partners, advocate for ergonomic workstations. I have staff that are, between 4'6" and 6'5". So that sink needs to move up and down to save their backs. We've got separate decontamination areas for manual or hand wash only and ophthalmic instrumentation. And then your automated cleaning equipment, it seems like it should be implicit that the automated cleaning equipment would be clean on the inside, but you might get detergent buildup, mineral buildup. If your concentrations are off, you'll end up with a lot of buildup within the machine and on the outside of the machine, and you can get a citation for that. Where's your critical water source? Is it DI? Is it RO? And is it available on final rinses? Not just at every sink, but every machine that's running instruments. So if you've got cart washers that are running case carts through an automated process, and they're validated for having instruments go through them as well, those cart washers better have a finished or critical water source as a final rinse for those instrument cycles. You've got an instrument air source, which means it's free of oil and other things that get added to house air, and you don't want that to deposit onto the instruments. If you've got immersion high-level disinfection like Cydex-OPA or glutaraldehyde, where does it live? If one of my facilities, it's in decontamination. I got to tell you, I hate it. It drives me bananas that you would be able to produce something that is patient ready in a decontamination area. I'm working actively to try to get rid of it, but be aware of where it is, and can it be located in a clean area or a separate area? And same thing with your automated endoscope reprocessors. Where do those live? If you see construction projects happening and you know about your ICRAs, are those barriers working? Do you see dust around the construction area? So when you're looking at the assembly and packaging workstations, do they have surface disinfectant available? I don't know that a lot of IPs realize that the packaging materials, like the blue wraps, I'm sure a lot of us have seen, filters, things like that, they have to be conditioned to the environment. Michigan, if you're anything like upstate New York, you have weather that operates on extremes. The winters, there's lots and lots of snow. It gets really, really cold. In the summer, it can be really hot and humid. If your packaging materials are living out on the loading dock, they've got to be conditioned to the environment before they are used inside the department. So they've got to come in, be staged. Generally around 2 hours is a good rule of thumb before they actually get used. Don't just bring them in from outside and then put them to use. You may end up with compromised packages because you haven't conditioned them to the environment, to the humidity and to the temperature. You've got dust and debris, again, are not existing on your shelves or inside bins that may be at workstations. Magnifying glasses or other vision enhancing equipment like borescopes, are those available? Or microscopes? Do people know how to use them? Do they know what they're looking for? Do they know what they see? And do they know what they do with that? That's another big point of agita for me as an IP and as an SPD director. If we implement borescopes, do my staff know what they're looking at? And do they know what to do? That's really just more data that they're collecting. So be prepared for any data that you collect. What are you going to do with that data once you find something? And are you sure that's what you found? And of course, corrugated cardboard. I've seen things come in on corrugated cardboard, they travel. Your sterile storage areas, at least 8 to 10 inches from the floor. Bottom shelves are solid. Top shelf is at least 18 inches from the ceiling. That's for fire protection. And again, when you're looking through here, you want to make sure that your rigid container systems, the locks are intact. that there's no obvious holes or anything like that, that there is sterilization stickers with the load, the date, and all of that required information. I'll go into that on the next slide, that it's present on your items in sterile storage. You don't have to go through everything unless you find that you have something that's missing an indicator that indicates sterilization has been achieved and maintained. But if you do find something that's questionable, then you will want to dig deeper. So when you are looking through your sterile storage areas, your wrapped items ideally are stacked above your rigid container systems. The heavier trays and package are stored really at the optimal place, which is about waist level, just for employee safety and ergonomics, that your peel packed items are stored vertically. You don't have expired supplies or packages present, and that everything is labeled with the sterilization information, which is which sterilizer was used, the cycle number, the date of sterilization, and if applicable, the expiration date. If your facility follows event-related sterility, make sure your policy is very clear on that. So I'll ask, somebody can go ahead and jump off mute, but go ahead and tell me what's wrong with this picture. If you look here.
This your dressing is compromised.
Yeah,
Screwed.
so this is a filter. This is a hydrophilic filter. And so I've never seen this in all of my years, right? Almost 20 years I've worked in healthcare. This is the first time I saw it, and this happened about a month ago. So this is a laparoscopic instrument set. When you look at the laparoscopic instruments, they have a rack that the long instruments sit on, and they often are seated into like a silicone insert so they don't move during sterilization. Somehow, whether this wasn't placed correctly or what, the instrument ended up popping out of the rack and actually penetrated the filter. And this was found in sterile storage. I've never seen anything like this because the filters tend to be pretty durable, and it's pretty difficult to actually, even when you're scrubbed into surgery, take those instruments out of the rack sometimes. So when I learned about this, this was stunning to me. So I wanted to make sure I included it. So make sure when you're looking at your containerized sets that, you're just doing a once over, just glance over to make sure there's no obvious holes in the filters. If you've got single space reprocessing areas, which you can often find in clinics, again, does that layout support the correct movement through the reprocessing steps from dirty to clean? You're not going from your sinks and working backwards to your sterilizer, and then once your sterilization is done, you're now moving past your sinks to get to a storage area. You want a unidirectional path of travel, and you need to have adequate space between your soiled areas, your packaging areas, and your high-level disinfection or sterilization areas in your storage. I don't want to be able to be standing at a sink decontaminating an endoscope, be able to reach behind me and touch the scope storage cabinet. That's way too close, and my arms aren't very long. So there's a lot to unpack in this picture. What's wrong with this one?
Well, the fan is nice big.
Yep. You've got a fan. This is from
You have lotion.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in this photo. So this is a consultative one I grabbed when I was doing a consult for somebody and walking through their clinical area. And so the walls are pretty beat up. The lotion, I'm all about maintaining skin integrity, but not where we are drying our sterilized instruments that have come out of a tabletop sterilizer. This was all written, if you see the writing and the stamps, that was all put onto the package before the sterilization happened, which means that once the steam hits, it now creates a compromise in the packaging, and you now have technically contaminated everything in there. It's all being dried by this fan on top of this terry towel. There's a lot going on here. So when you're talking about the personnel knowledge and behaviors to assess your SPD partners with, you want to make sure that the soiled items that are staged for decontamination are not dry. And this really, I say this in the most loving way, SPD does not generate blood, bone cement. We don't generate it. It comes to us, right? So if you're finding soiled items in your decontamination areas that are dry or heavily soiled, The folks to go back to are the folks where those items originated from. They're not performing that point of use processing as defined by AORN, by AAMI, and many others about what the best practices are. Are the required PPE being used during these activities? I've seen some very creative interpretations of PPE compliance over the years. I have seen gowns literally cut where there's a gap between the shoulder and the elbow because the technicians get hot. It's hot work, it absolutely is, but we still have to maintain the PPE. So if you find that staff are doing that, they might need some cooling solutions, cooling vests or something similar that's going to keep them safe, keep them cool. Is reusable PPE cleaned between all your different employees, their uses in at least every shift? And can they speak to what the process is for managing and reporting bloodborne pathogen exposures? I just had one happen last week. Somebody managed to get stuck with a really small, sharp retractor while they were at the sink. It's tough to be able to look down to the bottom of the sink. There's definitely ways to protect themselves, but if they don't, do they know and can they report how to manage and report any exposure that happens? What are the concentrations for your detergents and what's the correct temperature range for it to be mixed with water, and how is that checked? Do your decontamination happen? Do those activities happen below the surface of the water and the detergent? I used to love, especially when rounding an endoscopy, they would be so excited for me to come in and show me that they know how to clean the duodenoscopes, and they would literally lift up the distal end and show me that they were brushing it and show me that they were flushing the detergent solution through. I'm like, that's great. Put it below the surface of the water. That's to minimize the aerosolization potential that can happen. One tray or one endoscope at a time is being decontaminated, and that's just to avoid cross-contamination potential. Automated washer equipment's being loaded correctly. Basins that might be open, they're put on their side. They're not right side up so they can collect all the detergent and water, and then they're blocking the impingement capability of the arms in your washer disinfectors or your washer sterilizers for the instrumentation that's loaded underneath. The movement in the spaces from dirty to clean, and again, those IFUs have to be followed. So is there evidence of efficacy testing happening? So it would be like a TOSI test, that's the gold standard, or something similar. There are plenty of dye tests that are available on the market. Every day that your SPD is operational, your automated cleaning equipment, so washer disinfectors, ultrasonics, those have to be tested. Are ophthalmic instruments managed separately? Because heat stable endotoxins absolutely pose a risk to ophthalmic instruments, and that risk then creates the risk for TAS, toxic anterior segment syndrome. It's not an infection, it's an inflammatory response. But often you may be called if there's a case of TAS or several cases of TAS, because in all honesty, IPs have the capability to do that investigative work to say, oh yeah, this might be the contributing factor of why this is happening. So the American Academy of Ophthalmology, they have got guidelines on their website about how to best manage their ophthalmic instruments, and it's also an AMI ST79. So what's wrong with this picture? Does anybody first know what kind of cleaning equipment this is? This is an ultrasonic, right? So this is a sonication unit. And so in this particular instance, when I was doing a consult for somebody, what they were doing was putting everything into the ultrasonic. The way that an ultrasonic unit works is by using sonication waves. There's like these transducers that live in the bottom of this tank, and they send sonic waves through the transducers into the tank. Bubbles form in the detergent water solution. Those bubbles end up latching onto the surfaces of your instrumentation or whatever you have contained in there. The bubbles get bigger and bigger and bigger until they explode. When they explode, that's when the debris that might be on the surface is lifted. Well, if you weigh it down or you put too much stuff inside the sonic, it's going to dampen the sonication waves. And that's exactly what's happening here. They were putting everything into the sonic. And so now nothing is being effectively sonicated because there's too much weight in order for that sonication to actually work. Also, if you put rusty instruments into a sonic, when those bubbles start to get bigger and bigger and they burst, they lift the rust off the surface, but that rust is still floating around the sonic, and it can start to seed and deposit onto other instruments and create more rust issues. So when you think about key performance indicators in decontamination, we're thinking, for me, first thing, throughput time. That's the time that something arrives into decontamination until it's in the next step of the process, which I would consider for me to be the time it comes out of the washer. How long does that take? There's no national benchmark. So really it's about your facility time studies and how can you improve that without cutting corners. But where this becomes important is when I look at these data, I go, okay, this is my bottleneck. Is it a personnel issue? Is it a process related issue? Do we not have enough infrastructure? Is there too much volume? And I think the reason why this is good for IPs to be familiar with is when sterile processing starts to have issues with quality, this is something you can look at to say, okay, wow, you've got a really big bottleneck. Those dried instruments that came to you from the OR now are sitting there for hours waiting to be decontaminated because you don't have enough resources, right? So just if your facility doesn't measure it, ask if it's possible to start thinking about how to measure it. What is your acceptable and unacceptable receipt of soiled items from your customers? So ORs, clinics, nursing units. Is it captured? How is that reported back? What does that feedback look like for continuous quality improvement? How many contaminated trays are reaching the assembly areas and how many are reaching the ORs or other clinical areas? Because again, you want to know as part of your error rate, how much of that is related to contamination and misses in your decontamination area. And then sharps received and sharps injuries, things happen. You'll end up with knife blades, hypos, and things like that arrive into your decontamination area are people getting injured as a result. So when you think about those KPIs, this photo on the left actually is from our 2022 Joint Commission survey. The physician surveyor just happened to be there when a case card arrived. And this was the case card that arrived. And this is where I say, when you think about soiled instrument handling, which is such a huge focus for Joint Commission and for IPs, that we are making sure we're going back to the end users. Instruments have a use in them, and the use is not from your sterile processing folks. So you've got to make sure that whenever something comes up in that ICO 4101 EP2, that you know that, okay, this is the issue that we have. Is it SPD? Is it the end user? So that you are targeting your interventions to the appropriate entity. That photo on the right, I'm going to own this one because when I was an IP, in an effort to try to make it really easy for the ambulatory clinics to be compliant with soiled instrument handling, this is what resulted on the right-hand side. You just start dumping instruments, which makes it really easy for the clinic. It makes it really dangerous for SPD, especially if they've got hidden knife blades or sharps and things like that. So something that I learned as a lesson, but it took me being an SPD director to learn what the implication was for the SPD teams receiving a red bin like this. When you're looking at your packaging material, is it protected from contamination? Hopefully it's not sitting on the loading dock in January when you've got 4 feet of lake effect snow on the ground, but you definitely want it protected from contamination. Your integrators are stored in a way that prevents premature change. So they're not sitting on windowsills. They're not sitting directly underneath your fluorescent lights, and they're not being exposed to excessive heat from your sterilizers once those doors open. Your biologicals are stored and handled according to the IFU. If they're mishandled at the time that the biological has to be read, it may be inadvertently contaminated, and you may end up with a false positive, which means you may end up with a recall of instrumentation that was preventable. How are your instrument quality checks being performed? Are you using borescopes or other advanced visual inspection? Are they flushing with water, anything like that, just to check lumens? And are tapes, dips, or other identifiers being maintained? Tape is not prohibited, but tape is difficult to maintain. 1.5 turns around the ring handle. It's not to go on blades of scissors. It's not to go on the distal tips of forceps. There's very specific techniques that are required to apply and maintain tape. So it's just, for me, for a system of my size, it's exceptionally difficult to maintain, and there are better strategies out there. But tape is not prohibited, and I know that can be socialized from time to time. Same thing with dip. You can color dip. scissors or other instrumentation to help better identify who owns what or which set does it go in, but that has to be maintained as well. It can't be flaking or tearing or otherwise in disrepair. How are your packages labeled? Make sure that your packaging materials are validated for the sterilization method that you're using, right? Where are the inventory or count sheets placed? Or is it before or after that terminal process? It really should be before, but are they placed before sterilization inside the container? Are they placed inside of a pack, right? Or an envelope? That's something you definitely want to dig down on. As an OR nurse over the years, I definitely have counted instruments that had the count sheet imprinted on them from the sterilization. Are the chemical indicators appropriately placed in the trays, which means in the center of the tray, the most challenging area? There may need to be more than one indicator, especially if you have subsequent packaging inside that's holding things. And I'll show you a photo of this in a moment, but you definitely have to have indicators in the most challenging areas. And it's all used in a compliant fashion. I've seen some very creative things over the years about how packaging material is used. So with this one, you may not be able to see immediately, but now that the arrow is there, these are pouches with an integrated integrator, right? That were all pre-sterilized before they were used. So this was identified in a clinic setting. And what the report was from that clinic was, well, there was dental stuff, dental handpieces. And they said, well, the dental handpieces don't have to be sterilized, which they were not incorrect on in this instance. They said, but the clinicians won't use them if they're not in a bag that shows that they have been sterilized. Like, this is how they know that they're ready for patient use. But this was right next to a different area where dirty items were also being taken in for reprocessing. So the concern then comes to be, you've got these pre-sterilized bags or pill packs that can somehow maybe end up putting something in that's truly not ready for patient use, but it will show an indication of having been sterilized when it actually wasn't. This is a very dangerous practice. When we're talking about tape compliance, that's what's wrong with this picture. That is not a compliant application of instrument tape. That is absolutely not how it should be applied to forceps. It is creating edges, it's in disrepair. So again, make sure that if your facility is using tape, you know who's applying the tape and you know that they're applying it correctly. This is not correct. What's wrong with this picture? When I talk about having indicators in some of the most challenging areas, this is where I say, be sure that when you go into your ORs or wherever your point of use is for your sterile instrumentation, you check to make sure that assembly has actually happened correctly. Make sure that your towels, like this green towel, is actually validated for being inside a sterile set. Towels and additional packaging material inside your sterilized instrumentation sets add more challenge to the steam sterilization process, which means they may retain more moisture and you may end up with wet packs. Here, you've got a peel pack that's actually too big for the items it contains. So it's been folded upon itself, again, creating another layer of challenge for the steam to try to get through. So that peel pack should be much shorter to meet the need of whatever's being stored in there, which I think in this case is some laparoscopic like end caps and things like that, and a Lure lock. And then here, this is something that, again, you want to make sure that this package right here is validated for being placed inside of a containerized set. What can anybody tell me, and just go ahead, feel free to come off mute. Anybody tell me what's wrong with this picture?
It looks like they're horizontally stored with peel packs.
Yeah, so in this one, again, this is me airing dirty laundry a little bit, but please feel free to learn from our opportunities that we had. So in this instance, because there's too much volume going through for the physical plant. So the SPD staff and leader were overloading the sterilization racks. Steam sterilizers actually have weight limits on them. And it just ask your SPD leaders, like, hey, what's the weight limit for your sterilizers? Because especially when best practice says no set should weigh total weight, including packaging, more than 25 pounds. That's not just for employee safety, but that's also because of density that can arise from having such heavy sets. Because there's so much volume of work needed to support the surgeries, they were overloading these sterilization racks, and we were ending up with wet packs. And with these peel packs, you're right, they were being stored in some cases horizontally. And I was getting reports of peel packs with indicators that had never turned, which is definitely a major problem. This practice has since stopped. As soon as I found out about it, that practice came to a screeching halt. And this is where practices like this that evolve out of convenience or meeting a need, I feel very strongly, and my leadership knows I feel very strongly about not creating an illusion of patient safety, that we are not going to cut corners to keep patients safe. This practice stopped. We have since gone back and said we have to slow down the work. We need to renovate this space to better meet our needs if this is the volume of work that needs to go through. And I think this is where IPs really can help be a partner and advocate for sterile processing folks. If you hear that there's wet packs happening, check to make sure, is there too much packaging material going into those sets? Like I just showed you with that green towel set, but also what do the sterilization loads look like? Are they being loaded properly? If there were containerized sets on here, those silver aluminum containers, I would expect to see them at the bottom, below wrapped sets and below peel packs. They should not be up top or above wrapped sets or peel packs, because they can hold moisture and then drip moisture down onto the stuff that's below them. You definitely don't want to see towels as an effort to try to reduce moisture as well, because actually you may end up retaining more moisture and contaminating the sets that are on that rack. This is a thorn in my side. These are loaner trays, and to protect the not innocent, I have grayed out the name of the vendor here. But this was found in our parking lot. And here's something that I don't know is well socialized, but I want to make sure that IPs are aware of this. Hospitals, for good reason, right, have to borrow inventory for specific types of cases because the technology turns quickly, may be cost prohibitive to bring in all this inventory. There may not be enough space to store all of this inventory, but your loaned inventory from your vendors is only as strong as the weakest facility that handled it. So if, as I like to say, if Joe's Tire Shop and Ambulatory Surgery Center puts instruments into the sink, just sort of, runs water over them, throws everything into the ultrasonic where you may get mixing of metals and reverse plating that happens, and then they don't inspect it, they just, hand it back to you and your facility's really busy, what's the policy for your loaned inventory to get into your facility? Is it 24 hours? We follow 48 hours just because of the volume that we say vendors have to bring their stuff on site in order for us to adequately prepare them. But that loaned inventory is only as strong as the weakest facility that handled it. So if you are seeing an uptick in surgical site infections, just keep this in mind, especially on spine or orthopedic procedures. Those tend to be very loaner heavy service lines. So if you're starting to see an uptick, just keep this in your mind as a potential, especially if they're happening, I would say, within the first 7 to 14 days after the surgery. So when you're looking at quality insurance and those key performance indicators for loaned inventory, how many sets are being borrowed and what is the compliance for them getting in a timely manner for your elective surgeries? Especially if you're at a trauma center, when you're talking about add-ons, it sort of has to be removed from the denominator. But when you're talking about your elective surgeries, if I have a case that's scheduled for Friday, I am expecting those loaned inventory sets and implants possibly to arrive by Wednesday. So my team has enough time to adequately prepare them. Because again, I don't believe in cutting corners. It just doesn't set well with me. And vendors can absolutely put sterile processing at their mercy if they're not following your policy. And what's your error rate? So this is, again, ideally you're identifying them pre-sterilization, but you may also do post-sterilization audits, which I would recommend. Joint Commission is coming in, and when they're doing their accreditation surveys, they're asking for sets and they're opening them up, not just in SPD, but everywhere. Your cath labs, your clinics, your nursing units. They're looking at the quality of instrumentation. They're looking for, is there evidence of rust or staining, not just on the instruments, but on the packaging materials below? Are hinged instruments staying open? Because what happens in steam sterilization is when that vacuum or that air evacuates out of the chamber, you can get movement that happens of the instrumentation, including on hinged instruments. So is there a way that they're being maintained open? Errors can also include missing internal or external indicators, filter issues. So if you've got retention plates on those containerized sets, is the retention plate falling? Is it loose? When the OR, whoever takes off the lid, is the filter in place? Because now it's going to be compromised if it wasn't, or is there moisture noted? If you've got high level disinfection, again, and your sterilization, how often is that equipment getting clean? There's evidence of process challenges for each sterilizer every day that it's in use. So if you're running Prevac or dynamic air removal sterilizers, you've got evidence of Bowie Dick or DART tests, depending on what you're using. You've got evidence of BIs. We run biological indicators in every single steam sterilization load, and we're starting to evaluate whether every load monitoring across all our modalities, including low temp, is the safest way to go. Are your steam sterilizers in your SPDs used for full cycles, or do they have programmed IUSS cycles in there? Because it's not just the autoclaves that may live in your substerils or your smaller format autoclaves that have IUSS capability. You might have IUSS capability on your larger format steam sterilizers in your departments. You'll definitely want to ask if they're programmed. What's the process for returning them to service? Amy ST79 has a really great algorithm in there about requalifying after major repairs, after a sterilizer's been moved, or if it's just been recently installed. And then how are your hydrogen peroxide cassettes stored for your low temp gas plasma or your vaporized hydrogen peroxide? Because that's sensitive to light. Are your immersion stations clean? If you have immersion stations, are your filters changed according to the IFU? The dates, nothing's expired, right? How are items that undergo high-level disinfection or liquid chemical sterilization rinsed? Are they tested before every use? Because if you're not testing them before every use, those wet implements, whether it's a sleep mask or a scope or what have you, that's going into that immersion is carrying residual water. You carry enough residual water into those bins, you're going to start to dilute the disinfectant. And again, for your liquid chemical sterilization systems, you've got chemical indicators that are present. How often are your AERs clean? Is it according to IFU? If you're running them very frequently, you might have to exceed the IFU if the AER is not looking clean. Are the connectors clean, and are they validated for the flexible endoscopes and TEE probes that are being reprocessed through them? So when you look at what's wrong with these pictures here, you're getting buildup inside the chambers, right? And that's something that is a low-hanging fruit for a surveyor. On this right side, we would actually close or shut down our sterilizers for safety so that they could get cleaned every month. Even though our IFU for our sterilizers says clean them every quarter, we just use them 24/7 at most of my hospitals, that we have to clean them every month. What happens is you shut them down, you let them cool down for several hours. The gentleman that we've contracted with, he comes and he cleans them, but you can end up with this bolus of whatever your steam treatment is that is now accumulated in your steam lines, that as soon as you kick the machine back on, boom, here comes all this debris into your freshly cleaned chamber. So just bear that in mind. If you're getting reports like this, ask about the types of water treatment or steam treatment. Is that something that may be contributing? This is just a table that I'll let you digest later about what your liquid chemical sterilization, your disinfection records need to have in order to be considered complete. Same thing with your steam sterilization records. And again, as you're going through your sterile storage areas, as you're going through your clinical areas, just do some spot checks to make sure that this information is contained on those packages. I am proud and pleased to say that the reprocessing single-use device chapter in the APIC text online has been updated. I updated it with my colleague, Jean Ricapito, and it's specifically because of this. And I know we ran into this specifically during the pandemic with tourniquet cuffs when there was a global shortage. But by and large, unless you've got something in an emergent situation like a public health crisis that says you can now all of a sudden through these validated methods reprocess something that's considered single use, do not do it. You are considered the device manufacturer if you reprocess single use devices. And by doing so, you assume all of the responsibility that comes with it. So if your facility is not licensed for it, do not do it. If your facility is utilizing reprocessed single-use devices, be sure that that reprocessing is getting done by an FDA licensed facility, and they are considered the device manufacturer. So as healthcare networks grow, and you get new clinical spaces, you get clinics that may be removed from your hospitals, or you may be getting a new hospital tower or a new OR and SPD. Your SPD partners in infection prevention, you must be at the table starting at the concept phase. If they're bringing you in at the time of the ICRA to ask for barriers, that's way too late in the process. I'm a big proponent of ear hustling and leaning in, and sometimes just going in like a wrecking ball. If I have to be there to make sure that the space gets designed correctly right from the onset. And so who needs to be at the table to discuss the reprocessing needs and resources? The physical plant, it's got to be maintained to the highest standards like your ORs. It's got to move in one direction. Make sure that you've got terminal cleaning happening every day of operation, that there's evidence of it, because chances are, and I speak from experience, you're going to get a surveyor that asks for evidence of it. If they see dust or debris or other evidence of dinge in your SPD, you want to assess the personnel knowledge, and it can be performed by you. But if you have questions, just go ahead and take the information down and go back and check later on. Don't feel like you've got to go in right from the onset and be the expert going in. This is an opportunity to use your documents and your policies and procedures. Reach out to your IP networks and resources. Again, reach out to me if you've got questions about what you may have seen or what you may have encountered. If it wasn't documented, it didn't happen. Review of high-level disinfection sterilization records, they're not off limits. You've got to be sure your IFUs are being followed. When you've got contradictions, you've got to make sure they reconcile between the device manufacturers and whatever equipment you may be using, if it's an AER or if it's a point-of-use high-level disinfection system, right? And you got to do that before implementation. Again, I cannot underscore enough, using single-use devices cannot be reprocessed unless you are federally licensed to do so. I highly recommend to avoid it and outsource it. But we are a vital service. Surgery really doesn't happen without us, and that we have to be respected as such because we are the heart of the hospital. And this is where IPs have an opportunity to be a partner and an advocate for sterile processing. And that's what I have. I am happy to take some questions.
Rebecca, thank you so much. That feels like a whirlwind. You covered a ton of content. There have been a lot of chats as you've been talking about how great the content was, the slides, the recording. So I think we have certainly a lot of interest, which dovetails nicely into the numerous questions we have. I know we won't have time to get through them all, but I want to start with some and see how many we can get through. And then whatever we aren't able to do live, we can get responses and follow up afterwards. So the first one I want to start with is, do you have any recommendations on how to begin removal of tape on surgical instruments?
Yeah, and Russ, you're absolutely right. This is an absolutely enormous project. If you haven't undertaken it before, this is where you've got to have adhesive removers, because what you don't want to do is leave adhesive residue behind, especially if the tape is old. You can get staining that happens. What does give me some agita to see is when I see technicians taking a knife blade and they start trying to scrape at it to get it removed. That's not the best way to approach this, because you can damage the passivation layer on the instrument itself, and now you've really damaged the entire instrument. So what we've actually had to do at this point is outsource the tape removal. So as we see taped instruments coming through, we're grabbing them. We've outsourced it to the same gentleman that cleans our sterilization chambers. We have a contract with them for a lot of different repairs and work like this. So we've just outsourced it, and we've actually moved towards laser etching our instrumentation to help better denote ownership.
And so, Rebecca, that kind of leads us nicely into another question that came in. It says, do you recommend chemical or laser etching? And it sounds like laser etching, yes. What about chemical?
Again, when you're considering chemical etching, you got to consider whether or not the passivation layer is going to be damaged as a result. Even laser etching over time will start to wear off and you have to re-etch the instrument. So just be sure that whatever method you're using is not going to damage that passivation layer. Once the passivation layer is damaged, that's where you start to get issues with rust and other deformities to your instrument.
Another question, have you ever tried to get used instruments restrung by peri-op staff prior to sending down to decontamination?
Yeah, so this is a pain point for me right now. And this again talks about process, and when this seems a little bit like minutia for an IP, but when we're talking about opportunities to gain efficiency and you're looking at your throughput time, right? Where are your opportunities to improve that throughput time? If the instruments are coming in a big giant mess, number one, it creates a danger to your staff in your decontamination area. If the instruments aren't being restrung, then now you also have issues with trying to get stuff through. And if you find that your staff are now having to take time to sort through instruments in your prep pack area and it's taking a long time, the reason why I'd say this is important for IPs is because that's when corners start to get cut. And that's when you start to see some real creative interpretations of meeting the need that aren't exactly safe for the patients.
All right, we'll do one more because I know we're at 2 o'clock. You made a couple comments about no towels, and there was a question of, can you just clarify what you mean by that? Did you mean no towels under trays on the racks that go into the sterilizer, or related to something different?
Yeah, so a couple different things. So you can use only very certain towels in your packaging material for like a wrap, for example, right? As a means of trying to wick away moisture that will then evaporate and dry in the sterilization cycle. If you put too much towel or if you put too heavy of a towel, it actually won't dry and it will now create a wet pack. On your sterilization racks, especially if they're overloaded, what you may start to see are people trying to facilitate drying with laying towels over the rack or the cart of the sterilizer or the sterilization cart, but it now creates another medium for moisture to retain. And again, if you don't have long dry times or if your sterilization load is really dense and heavy, they're not going to dry and they are going to create compromises to the items that you just tried to sterilize because of retained moisture.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. There are a number of questions that we did not have a chance to get to. So like I said, we have note of these on the APIC Great Lakes, and Rebecca, we will follow up with you afterwards because there are some really good questions in here, but I do want to be mindful of folks' time and get us on our way. So thank you, Rebecca, so much for joining us.
And I've just popped, Kelsey, I just popped my email into the chat, so feel free to email me. I'll be in New York starting tomorrow night, but I am checking email.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
All right.